Welcome to today's webinar, Tariffs 101 and the latest updates, brought to you by the NFIB Small Business Legal Center and Research Center. To our current NFIB members, thank you so much for being an active participant in the small business conversation and for your continued support. To those who are not yet members, welcome and consider joining the nearly 300,000 small business owners who are fighting for small business with NFIB. Our success is based on strength in numbers. Each new NFIB member makes our voice a little louder and strengthens our efforts to fight anti-small business legislation. If you are or know a small business owner who needs their voice to be heard, visit NFIB.com or call 1-800-NFIB now. Here are a few reminders. If you have any issues with audio, please ensure your computer speakers are set up properly and know that your internet connection does affect the clarity of sound. We are recording today's presentation, and after the webinar, all registrants will receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar and link to download the slides. We encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box on the right of your screen. Just click Ask a Question and type your inquiry. And we typically get a lot of questions during these webinars, so if we don't get to your particular question, we hope we will answer one that will be helpful to you. And our speakers for today are Holly Wade, Executive Director for the Small Business Research Center, and Elizabeth Melito, Executive Director for the Small Business Legal Center. I'll hand things over to them now. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Casey. And great to be with everybody who are on the webinar live and also listening to the recording. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and with Beth Melito and myself, we're going to go through a few basic questions related to tariffs and then go through the recent changes in tariffs. I wanted to mention that last Wednesday, we did have our first tariff update webinar, which many of you may have attended, and it was on the technical side, but Mitchell from law firm in Michigan did a great job in outlining a lot of the technical information that small business owners were interested in better understanding, kind of what the new landscape is as far as the new tariff policies, what they mean, how to go about finding information related to them. And about 15 minutes later, after the end of our webinar, the policy changed. So we had a 90-day pause on those reciprocal tariffs, most of the reciprocal tariffs, not all of them. And we will go through all the kind of the landscape of what the tariffs look like now, and we will continue to update everyone as new information becomes available to us. So thank you again for joining. The last week's webinar is in the chat, and so if you're interested in a deeper dive on kind of the state of play and some of the more technical aspects of tariff policy, please look for the link in the chat and you can register and watch the recorded version of that webinar. And there are also some other resources that are in the chat that might be of interest to you from the Customs and Border Agency. And so we have some email link there if you have specific questions or concerns that you would like to ask the Customs and Border Agency. The direct email is there, and also their website that houses a lot of information related to the changes in trade and tariff policy. And then also, today's slides are available at the link that Beth has posted in the chat. So for anybody who we received a lot of pre-submitted questions. Hopefully we will be able to answer all of them during this webinar. Please, if you have additional questions, You can ask them in the Q&A chat box here. And afterwards, if we haven't answered your question directly, or if you think of another question while listening to the webinar, please don't hesitate to email us any of your questions related to tariffs at info@nfib.org. And that's info@nfib.org. And we check that email box many times a day, and we'll get back to you promptly with responding to your questions. So if you have any questions afterwards, or that were pre-submitted and we weren't able to get to them and you would like a response, please email us there at info@nfib.org. And we also have an NFIB tariff tracker. So all of the updates related to the changing tariff policies are located in this tariff tracker that Beth has linked in the chat. That can also be helpful if you're looking for specific executive orders, reading through them to better understand, and just a basic overview. So I will start off with what are tariffs and why do governments implement tariffs in the first place? So there are a lot of different terms that folks use in talking about tariffs, and it can get pretty confusing quickly. One is just talking about them in terms of a tax. So a tariff is a tax on imported goods and services that are implemented by the government. So in this case, the US government has implemented tariffs on imports from other countries and also on specific products. So tariffs are a tax. They're also sometimes called duties or import duties. So if you've heard that term, a lot of times they're used interchangeably. Duties are generally placed on product based on the value of the product. And tariffs, and so duties are a bit separate but interchangeable. Tariffs are often temporary, a temporary tax on imported goods and services. And for most countries, they offer kind of three different ways of trying to achieve a policy goal as far as implementing a tariff on a country or a product. One is to raise government revenue. So when products or services are imported into the country that is importing the product, they collect the tariff. So they collect the tariff. It goes to either general revenue or to whatever program that those dollars are going towards. But they are a revenue raiser. And then for the protecting domestic industries, they're used as a protection mechanism for certain industries that either for national security reasons or for other reasons that a government would want to place some sort of protection, increasing the cost of those imports and driving consumer consumption or business consumption to domestically manufactured products or services. So that's number two. And number three, a tool for negotiation. So they are used for negotiating better terms in whatever capacity the government is looking to use those tariffs as a negotiating tool. And many times they're, two or three are used kind of in unison. So tariffs can be used again in many ways, many capacities, but they are a tax on U.S. goods, and the imported goods. The tariffs are collected from the government that is issuing the tariff. But again, it does look like, those words are interchangeable: tax, tariff, duty. For these purposes, we're going to call them tariffs. So a lot of questions related to who pays the tariff, how are they, who pays them, how are they collected, at what stage in the process are they are they being collected? So who pays the tariffs? The tariffs are paid by the importer company, or as it's more formally, the purchaser, or is more formally called, the importer of record. So the importer of record is the entity that's paying the tariff to the Customs and Border Agency. So we pay the tariff of, the importer, the purchaser pays the tariff at the port of the imports coming into this country before they are, kind of offloaded and into the economy for whoever the end purchaser is. And the tariff is placed at that point. So it is the U.S. government collecting the tariff or that tax on imported goods, whether it is the whole good itself or if it's, part of the good that is subject to the tariff. Say if it's a product, it's the value of that kind of input of whatever is being tariffed in the final product. So it can get a bit complicated depending on whether it is the country that has the tariff impacted by the tariff or the product itself, the good that is being tariffed. So it is at the port of entry coming into the US where it is tariffed. How that tariff is paid throughout the system gets far more complicated. So the purchaser of origin, the main purchaser of the product, they're paying the tariff first. And then it goes down kind of the supply chain of whether it is through the company that's using it to input into a final product and the company that is purchasing from either the wholesaler or the distributor or the company itself that is the purchaser of origin. It kind of flows through the supply chain of how it's being absorbed, and eventually it ends up being absorbed by the price of the end product to the customer or the business who is the final purchaser. So it gets complicated on how through the supply chain it ends up being passed on, but generally at the end of it, it is the final consumer or the business who is the final purchaser of that product or service that has the tax imposed on it in whatever capacity it is. So looking at that, there are a lot of changes. Again, as I mentioned, 15 minutes after our last webinar, the landscape changed quite dramatically. And I will start sharing my slides here so we can go through some of those changes. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And also, if there are any questions afterwards, please email us at info@nfib.org. So let me share my screen here.
And Holly, while you're doing that, this is Beth Melito, and I was just going to say, because we did get a question on that again on we actually received several in advance on who pays for tariffs. So I just wanted to underscore again that tariffs initially are paid by the importing firm. So the company that is importing the product is paying the tariff. The exporting country's government does not pay the tariff. It's the importing firm,
Yes.
right, that pays the tariff. And
yes,
the
and
tariff
we're paying
is
it to the U.S. government.
Right. And the tariff is collected by the U.S. government, specifically the Customs and Border Protection Agency. And in the Q&A chat there, I do have the link for Customs and Borders website, which has all the latest tariff information along with an email that you can go to. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to again underscore, who is paying for the tariffs and sort of what are tariffs.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let me get to my slides. Again, looking at the different ways that people talk about tariffs as taxes, duties, tariffs, often interchangeable. Tariffs, duties are a tax, but you will hear people talking about them in with these three. But the main tariff that has dominated the news, and we'll start with the tariffs that are on the books right now. And the biggest impact are those tariffs that have been placed on China. So one of the questions that we received a lot at the beginning and continue to receive are all of the tariffs that have been placed on Chinese imports, are they isolated or cumulative? And so the answer to that is they are cumulative. So all of the tariffs that were in effect before February 4th are still in effect. So the tariffs that were placed on Chinese products back in the first Trump administration are still on the books, and the subsequent tariffs have been accumulating to this total tariff of roughly 145%. However, looking at, the cumulative effect of these tariffs, there are other tariffs related to specific products, duties on specific products coming from China. All of those are still on the books. So everything that you paid before February 4th is still on the books, and in addition to everything that's come since February 4th. So related to the tariffs since February 4th, we have the 10% tariff that was imposed right at the beginning, February 4th, that has stayed intact. And then there was the fentanyl tariff, increased to 20%. And then there were two reciprocal tariffs, one that on April 8th, that the initial reciprocal tariff increased it to 84% tariff. And then the second reciprocal tariff raised it again to 125% tariff. And if you include the fentanyl related tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs, that's how you get to 145%. Since the total tariff and these executive orders, there has been an exclusion announced for some products that were imported from China. And these have been termed as temporary reciprocal tariff exclusions. And those exclusions include smartphones, computers, laptops, disk drive, semiconductor devices, memory chips, flat panel displays, and other electronics. So there is this about 20 products that were specified in an executive order talking about that they are temporarily exempted. There's no end date yet for this exemption of these products, but we have heard from administration that they are considering these to be temporary. And also, just a note for those reciprocal tariff exclusions, they are just on the exclusion for the reciprocal tariffs. So the 20% on the first two, that's still in place. So they still are subject to a 20% fentanyl opioid tariff that was in place, March 4th. They are just excluding the reciprocal tariffs of the 125% for some temporary time frame. The other tariff that has been most notable, especially for many small business owners outside of the tariffs on China, are those that are impacting imports from Canada. So at the beginning, the administration implemented a tariff on all products, a 25% tariff on all products, a 10% tariff on energy, and 10% on potash. But on March 6th, just 2 days later, there was an exclusion for all of those goods that are under the USMCA free trade agreement. So for all of those goods that enter duty-free under the USMCA, they are not subject to the 25% tariff on Canadian imports. The 25% still is in effect for all products that are imported from Canada that are not part of the USMCA free trade agreement. So all of the other products that are coming from Canada into the US that are not under the USMCA agreement are subject to the 25% tariff. And that is the same situation for products coming from Mexico. So again, March 4th, 25% tariff was implemented on all imports from Mexico, and that was quickly adjusted to only those goods and services that were not under the USMCA agreement that was established in the first Trump administration. So for all those goods and services under the USMCA agreement, they are exempt from the 25% tariff. Everything outside of the USMCA coming up from Mexico, imported into the US, are subject to the 25% tariff. And then there are products that were included in his announcements over the last 2 months related to tariffs. And the two that were initially released were aluminum and steel. So aluminum, March 12th, 25% tariff on all aluminum products coming into the US, imports into the US. And this is regardless of country. So doesn't matter where they're coming from, all imports, or most countries, are subject to the aluminum tariff coming in, and it is a 25% tariff. That is also the same for steel. So steel products coming into the US, 25% tariff, mostly regardless of the origin of the steel coming into the US. So these are product tariffs, not country tariffs. The product tariffs are on top of the reciprocal tariffs. So if you are importing steel from a country that has a country reciprocal tariff that is implemented, this is on top. So they're all additive, they're not in substitution for. So all product imports that are tariffed, and if they come from a country that has a reciprocal tariff or a previous tariff or duty on them, it's in addition to and not in substitution of. And then the other area of products that is most notable is on the automobiles and automobile parts. On April 3rd, there was an implementation of a 25% tariff on all autos coming into the US. Again, regardless of country of origin, the product itself, the car, 25% tariff. And then on automobile parts, for parts coming into the US that are imported into the US, it is also a 25% tariff, and that will come into effect May 3rd. So in a few weeks, auto body parts or automobile parts imported into the US will be subject to a 25% tariff effective May 3rd. And then for all imports coming into the US, and this is a kind of blanket, not reciprocal tariff, this is just a blanket tariff for all imports coming into the US, 10% on all products of foreign origin. So all products, except for a very, very, very few exceptions, are subject to the 10% on all products of foreign origin coming into the US. And one of the more confusing tariffs, because there is, the element of not knowing which country for, those importing, the importers of Venezuelan oil. And one of the larger importers of Venezuelan oil is China. However, China has suspended its Venezuelan oil imports. So right now, they aren't subject to the 25% tariff related to those countries who are importing Venezuelan oil. And this is obviously one of those areas of major uncertainty, because this could, change, and those countries would be subject to this 25% tariff immediately. So that is one of the outliers that we've received a few questions related to, but right now, as it stands for Chinese imports, they are not currently subject to the 25% additional tariff because of their suspension of importing Venezuelan oil. Oh, sorry about that. Here we go. Back to this slide. As I was mentioning, 15 minutes after last week's webinar, there was a major shift in the portion of reciprocal tariffs that the president laid out on Liberation Day. The reciprocal tariffs were placed on pause. So for all of those reciprocal tariffs, that huge list of countries that were subject to them, and this is outside of Chinese imports, those are not exempted or not paused. So Chinese import tariffs are in effect right now. For the reciprocal tariffs, for all the other countries that were in place a few weeks ago, they are on pause for 90 days. The 90 days are up July 9th, 2025. And these tariffs would include the 20% on European Union imports, the 24% on Japanese imports, etc. All of those countries that were on the list that the president announced, they're all on pause except for the Chinese imports, all on pause until July 9th, 2025. For the reciprocal tariffs. They are still all subject to the 10%. The 10% on all imports are not part of that reciprocal tariff kind of regime of tariffs. That's different. Everything's subject to 10%, that the reciprocal are on pause until July 9th. This is to give time to renegotiate deals with these other countries. This is an area certainly of uncertainty for those businesses trading with those countries that were subject to a reciprocal tariff that have been paused. And, you know, as soon as we know updates as far as what the plans are, either in implementing or what possible countries might end up off the list of reciprocal tariffs, we will be sure to update our tariff tracker to make sure that we have the latest information on that. The other pause for some imports were related to Chinese goods that were loaded onto cargo ships, and this again is a bit of a tricky one to see where the timing is of maybe your goods that were being shipped over. But Chinese goods loaded onto cargo ships and in transit to the U.S. as the final destination no later than April 9th are not subject to the reciprocal tariffs, that 125% tariff. So just the reciprocal tariff, they're not subject to that as long as those shipments arrive in the US by May 27th. So for about another month, if you have goods coming from China that left the port in China by April 9th and arrives in the US by May 27th, then those goods are not subject to the 125% tariff, the reciprocal tariff on Chinese products.
And Holly, I think because we had a question for the order, and I'm hoping that I have the right link for the Customs and Border Protection announcement, giving that May 27th date. So I'm putting that in the chat box right now.
Oh, great. Wonderful. In addition to the tariffs that are on the books or those that are paused or delayed, for instance, you know, those that are in transit, there are other products that are under consideration. And I thought this just to have for your information if your business might be impacted by these, and you can make better decisions based on this information in adjusting your business moving forward and maybe anticipating some price increases related to this. The products that are under consideration right now, in formal consideration, are copper and also lumber and lumber derivative products. So those two products are being considered for tariffs. And again, those would be just tariffs on the products, not based on the country of origin of importing from that country, just the products themselves. And then on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. So those four kind of broader categories of products are under tariff consideration. The deadline for public comment has passed for copper. These will, well, especially for copper and lumber, likely not in effect until later this year with a report for the determination of whether they should be subject to tariffs this fall. But pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, there isn't kind of concrete information related to those products. So that's still one of those areas that we're paying attention to, and know that, there are a lot of small businesses owners out there that, rely on semiconductors, or whether they're the end consumer or in the supply chain process of using semiconductors. So that hasn't been quite fleshed out yet. Again, a lot of uncertainty related to the kind of ongoing changes in trade policy with the tariffs implemented for countries, but also on products themselves. So I think that is the end of the updates on tariffs and kind of the landscape of what it looks like right now. I will stop sharing my slides and we can go to questions that have been submitted previously. And so I don't know, Beth, if you have questions that we can try and answer here.
Right. Yeah. So we'll go through the ones that were submitted in advance. And I know we've got quite a few coming in the chat box now, and we will not be able to get to probably many of those today, but please send them to info@nfib.org. And some of them are technical, and I apologize. I answered some, and for some reason when I answered, I did a private reply rather than, so I apologize for that. But there were several on what I will call, and you mentioned, the country of origin and trying to avoid tariffs by doing what Customs and Border calls country of origin fraud. Not that anybody participating in this was necessarily trying to do that, but essentially what they were asking is, if it's a product that's made in China and then I import it to Canada and then I get it from Canada, can I avoid the China tariff? And the answer is
yeah.
Right. And I put the link
the answer,
in there.
Unfortunately, is no. They have to have material changes within the other country before they are imported to the U.S. to have the now the term is escaping me, but kind of the hybrid tariff regime of that product coming into the U.S. But you can't move cargo from one country to another country and just repackage it and import it. That is illegal. But a lot of times, those products that are coming from China to Canada, and then they're added on and materially changed in some way in a country before coming into the US, that happens all over the world. And then those tariffs are assessed accordingly on the value of that product coming into the U.S., depending on what stage of development that product was in those countries. So it does get complicated, but yes, you can't just reroute products from one country to another to kind of access lower tariffs.
Right. And I did put that, now I can't find the link too, but Customs and Border Protection does have information on country of origin fraud and what it sort of consists of there. So question from David, is the Venezuelan oil 25% tariff still in effect on China?
It is not. Right now, as far as I understand it, the Chinese government has suspended Venezuelan oil imports into China, and so they are not subject to the 25% tariff for those importing Venezuelan oil.
Okay. A question, thank you, Holly. Question from Kevin. He is a dairy farmer, and he was wondering if you could just give, if you have a sense as to how this might all shake out in his industry. And he does talk about major expenses for him are repairs and maintenance to farm machinery, including parts for the machinery. He does not plan to purchase any new machinery, so it's more ongoing parts for repairs.
So the areas that might impact him are the products that are imported for the replacement parts of his machinery that require aluminum or steel. So aluminum and steel, those 25% tariffs that are on imported aluminum steel might be kind of part of the supply chain of manufacturing the product themselves. Or if they're imported products, those components to repairing machinery, if they're imported from another country, they would be subject to, right now, the 10% import tariff. That's the import tariff that's regardless of country. If they're coming from China, although probably not coming from China right now because the tariff is so high, it's essentially shut down trade between the two countries for the most part. But wherever it's coming from, there will likely be a tariff associated with that. Right now, it's one of those companies that are supplying those parts. They might be going through their inventory right now, so maybe those parts aren't subject to tariffs or increased costs. But as they then, increase their supply of inventory of those parts, they will be subject to the tariffs. So, and then for dairy farmers, for other businesses that might be exporting their product, they may face retaliatory tariffs from other countries importing U.S. goods. So there are a few ways, it's one of those, whether it's direct increased costs related to tariffs or indirect because you're in the supply chain, or the retaliation of other countries based on their impact from our tariffs, that whole configuration might also impact you if you're an exporter.
Right. And I know you covered this a little bit already, but we have two questions on this, one in the chat box and one previously. What happens if you've pre-ordered supplies? You've paid for them, but they haven't shipped yet, so they're not on a container.
So if you've pre-ordered supplies, that is what you're paying the seller of the product. However, when they end up in our ports and you are offloading that product, you will have to pay the tariff. So the tariff is separate from what you agreed upon for the price of the product with the seller. That's a totally separate payment activity. So once your goods are here in the US and if they're subject to a tariff, that's when you would have to pay the tariff. And that is separate from the contract that you had with the seller of the product initially.
Right, because the tariff is being paid to
the U.S. government.
The U.S. government. And then a question from, let's see, it was another, I'm going to call it sort of the stacking thing. We sell aftermarket auto parts. A part is made in China, but our supplier is shipping from Canada. Which tariff would you anticipate I should expect? Canada, China, or both combined?
It depends. So a lot of the answers to these questions, because supply chains are so complicated, can go back and forth across borders a number of times. It just depends. So it's it could be a hybrid between China and Canada, depending on if Canada is adding value to that product within their country before it's imported into the US. It could be the tariff from China if nothing is happening to the product coming into the US. It all depends on the configuration of the supply chain and how it's getting here, what configuration of tariffs that it's going to be subject to. It would be a question for the distributor coming from Canada into the US, and the imports. Well, actually, no. It would be the US Customs and Border. That is where they would have the information. Asking the question to the email that Beth provided in the chat would be a great place to start, because it is very specific to what you are importing from Canada that is coming from China.
And we have several questions in the chat box that discuss, products that are reconfigured in Canada but contain products from China. So those, it depends, as Holly said too. So I think maybe if looking in your crystal ball, maybe a good one to close out on too. And I also, one other thing I want to mention too, is there are also quite a few questions in the Q&A chat box on the USMCA tariffs, and that's separate. And we do have additional information on that. I'm happy to share that. So email us info@nfib.org. because I think we don't have time, and I don't have the information at my fingertips right now to go through those right now. But going back to sort of looking in your crystal ball here, Holly, any thoughts on how this might play out over the next, coming weeks and months?
So unfortunately, this is one of the areas that the word uncertainty has been used 1,000 times a day by myself, by Beth, by everybody trying to navigate what this might look like in the next few months. We do have, timelines of whether it's the May 3rd timeline for certain deadlines, or the May 27th for imported products, or the July 9th for the end of that 90-day pause. What that looks like afterwards and changes that might happen in the meantime, it's really hard to tell right now. So unfortunately, there is no crystal ball. No one knows for sure how this is going to play out. That's the increased level of uncertainty that everybody is dealing with, and is, certainly a real issue and a huge source of stress for small business owners trying to navigate this. I do want to mention, back to the question related to, say, imports from China going through Canada coming into the US. The paperwork trail of the value add and all of that from each stage of the movement of those goods are hugely important to understand what at the end the purchaser of that good in the US is to pay the tariff. So having all of that information, having that paper trail documentation of the product in all of its different phases and iterations are essential in presenting and keeping for estimating the tariff that you would have to pay by the final import into the US. So just wanted to say that because a lot of it is a paper trail of where things are coming from and where in the routing of those products are the value adds and things like that in assessing the tariff when they're coming into the US. But as far as having the crystal ball, I don't know that anybody right now has the crystal ball, especially because a lot of the goals related to these tariffs are in negotiating and trying to reshore those manufacturing companies coming back and producing more within the US. So the time frame for a lot of these goals could be very different, and what those goals are that kind of rise to the top will determine on how long lasting they might be, and in which ones might be more long lasting than others. So the level of uncertainty is unfortunately very high, and causing a lot of consternation among businesses trying to navigate what to do and how best to approach business operations in this environment.
Thank you, Holly. That was excellent. Should we turn it back over to Casey? And again, send your questions to info@nfib.org, because I know there were some that we did not get to. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly and Beth, and thank you all for attending today. That concludes our webinar. Visit nfib.com for all of our webinars on demand. I'm Casey for NFIB. Have a great day.